Good morning. I'll be providing an overview of cannabis use and associated harms to set the scene for the rest of our panel. Cannabis, unlike other drugs, is not a single entity, but a class of drugs. And this makes it especially complicated to talk about because the different components have different effects, and it does increase the degree of difficulty in communicating messages around cannabis. Just at the broadest level, there are three forms of cannabinoids: the plant-based ones, the phytocannabinoids, the ones that our own body produces, which are known as endogenous cannabinoids, and finally, the group that received a lot of attention a few years ago across the world were the ever-multiplying synthetic cannabinoids. And that's an interesting group, which I don't have time to talk about, but it's kind of an example how identification of harm, widespread communication of those harms, and changes in legislation to make those drugs illegal really completely changed the landscape of their use and massively decreased the harms associated with them. There are more than 100 unique phytocannabinoids in the cannabis sativa plant, the sativa being the most common plant group. And in addition to those cannabinoids, there are also a range of other chemicals known as terpenes and murines. And they provide the unique flavors and smells associated with the cannabis plant. And it's argued by those who are strong proponents of the medicinal qualities in particular that these provide as yet unquantified and unqualified entourage and ensemble effects. So it's used as an argument for only the plant itself, not synthetic purified versions of any of the cannabinoids are appropriate for medical use. This, of course, is not yet to be decided in any way. There are also more than 500 other chemicals that are given off when cannabis is combusted, much like tobacco. The most common of these phytocannabinoids is the one that people use to get high, the intoxicating THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. And on the other hand, the most medically promising for conditions such as epilepsy, particularly those pediatric epilepsies, is cannabidiol, CBD, which is not intoxicating in most doses, but it does have some psychoactive effects, and I've seen those in studies that I've conducted. Smoked cannabis exerts its psychoactive effects within minutes, and they peak within 30 minutes, and they last 2 to 5 hours when smoked. When the cannabinoids are taken orally, they take much longer to take effect, and they last for a great deal longer. This is a graphic to show you the two main cannabinoid receptor systems that we have in our bodies. There are others being discovered, of course, but these are the main ones, and even then we know very little about them. You can see there in red the CB1 receptors, and they're most abundant in the frontal and cerebral cortex. And the CB2 receptors are most common in the lymphatic and reproductive systems, and so much more to understand about what those interactions might be. You might note there that down at the bottom of the graphic is the brainstem, which is responsible for breathing and cardiac function, for example. And there aren't CB1 or 2 receptors in that area, so that explains why with cannabis, we don't get those overdose deaths with acute use, because it does not exert effects on breathing and circulation, unlike opioids, for example, or alcohol. The abundance of CB1 receptors in areas that affect learning and memory and executive decision-making explain the kinds of effects that we see with cannabis use. So how is cannabis consumed? Well, at the top there, we have the way which we're almost familiar with, of the plant being smoked in various forms, either in joints, and it culturally depends whether you use tobacco or not, pipes, water pipes, bongs, which were most common in Australia, or even a hookah, which come back in fashion, if you like, within different communities and different age groups. The hollowed out cigar, the blunt, was really coming from minority culture in the US 20, 30 years ago. But I've certainly heard anecdotally, and looking at the data now, it's becoming more common, particularly amongst young users, where if you know young people who are suddenly smoking very cheap cigars, they're actually smoking cannabis, it's not for the tobacco effects. Vaporizers, the heated plant material development system shown there on the side really came out of the medicinal cannabis market, where it was thought to be a safer way to heat rather than combust the cannabis. It probably is safer, but it's not entirely safe. Other chemicals such as ammonia are released when you heat plant material. The other, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, are the very purified oils and waxes, which are taking over more and more of the market in the US, where medicinal and legal cannabis, recreational cannabis, has been driving increased levels of use. And as the more you use, the more tolerance you develop, and you need more and more potent versions of the product in order to get the same high. The medicinal market also saw the blossoming of the baked goods, the brownies, the cookies, the milk-based drinks, the sodas, the coffees. You can now, in the US, get shots of CBD in Starbucks. Capsules, typically the synthetic, just for completion, I've added it in there, is more of the medicinal products. Cannabinoid, for example, which is not available in Australia, is a THC synthetic. And more now, we're seeing topicals in the medicinal markets in the US, the ointments, the creams, and finally the pessaries and suppositories, if you've run out of other places to use your cannabis. Just an example here of the emerging administration methods relevant to adolescent use. Out of the medicinal products are these kind of gummy bear type products, which you can't tell the difference once it's out of the packaging, whether it's a regular gummy bear or quite a potent THC product. In that packet, there's 100 milligrams of THC. Each one of those bears is an adult dose to intoxication of THC. You can see there the vaping THC products, the lollipops, and one there which is a vaporizer which is disguised as a Ventolin asthma inhaler. So this means young people can use discreetly in schools and other institutions without any smell, or people being aware that they're actually becoming intoxicated at that point. One of the issues which is being driven by increasing availability and law changes is that the potency of the product is changing. This increased potency is associated with an increased incidence of psychosis and other mental health conditions in studies that have actually compared high and low level THC users over time and seen the different rates in psychosis. Potency is a way of describing the percentage of the principal psychoactive, THC, in any particular product. And it's generally higher than ever before, between 15 and 25%. You can see there a graph from the DEA in the US, and you can see from the mid-90s how much the average potency of the plant has changed. In my former centre, we funded a study of cannabis seized in New South Wales as part of the cannabis cautioning scheme, and we tested more than 200 samples and found that on average a high mean THC content consistent with the US of almost 15% and almost no CBD. We also looked at, there's a myth about bush bud being a much safer product than hydroponic, for example. Well, we didn't find any support at all for that mythology, where we looked at known seizures from indoor and outdoor cultivation sites, and there was no difference in the potency. It's related to the seeds. It's not related to how they're grown. Waxes and oils have extremely high potency, unbelievably more than 90%. It's pretty much pure THC that they can now extract. Daily use leads to very high tolerance to the effects that, when I was in Colorado last year talking to people in the industry, they say that if you're dabbing every day, you just can't get high anymore from that method. And so you have to take edibles, high potency edibles, because they're metabolized in a different way through the liver, and you can then get an additional high. So this is kind of a high chasing, very dependence producing pattern of use that hopefully we'll be doing everything to avoid in this country. Looking now at Australian patterns of drug use overall to see where cannabis fits in here, just ignore the text in the box that's related to the 2016 findings. And we see here that for the first time, in many decades, we've seen an increase in cannabis use from the data collected and reported last year. This might argue coincides with, number one, the approval of medicinal cannabis here in Australia. And of course, I'm biased in saying it also correlates to the closure of the National Cannabis Centre that I led. And we particularly specialised in getting messages out to young people and minority populations. So unfortunately, we've seen this increase. We've seen a very concerning increase with cocaine and ecstasy as well, as the environment becomes more permissive around drugs. But amongst amphetamines, which have been such a cause of concern because of the change from powder to crystal, fortunately, we have not seen an increase in amphetamine use. So that is one of the pleasing aspects of these data. We don't have this data for 2019, but just looking at what was leading up to the increasing levels of use measured 3 years later, and this is very much what was seen in the US. As the discussion became more positive around cannabis and the lobbyists were working very hard to reduce harm perception and to close down my centre, there was a large drop in the perception of cannabis being a problem drug in the preceding 3 years, a significant increase in recent use amongst older women as medicinal use was supported by government. And we know from other drugs over long periods of time where there is not the legal sanctions around use, women are more likely to take up that drug. Also, frequent use was up from around less than 1 in 5 to more than 1 in 3 using weekly or more often. And we know from epidemiological studies that this is the level where you start to see heightened rates of cannabis use disorder and other problems. Similarly, with young people, adolescents, of course, are a very important target group, as adolescent use is associated with greater problems throughout the life course. So once again, back in 2017, slight increase in cannabis use, decreasing with other drug classes, including amphetamine stable amongst this group. They did not have the cocaine increase, but they did have the ecstasy increase. And Paul Dillon and I have been doing some subsequent surveys in private schools where we have seen also this significant increase in ecstasy use. The final point I wanted to make around young people, and this is a breakdown of age by gender, is the absolute importance of getting in with targeted prevention strategies to prevent initiation in that 13, at the most latest 14, because after 15, and we see this in survey after survey, the patterns of use rapidly change to accelerate up to adult levels of use. In a couple of minutes overviewing cannabis-related risks, first of all, we need to be realistic and say most cannabis users, like most alcohol users, report either unproblematic, experimental, irregular use, or if they do run into problems, they manage to abstain over time on their own. Consequences, however, are more likely if use is frequent in larger quantities and from an early age, particularly before the age of 16. Amongst other factors we've touched on already, increasing potency in retail products in the US, which has very much driven the acceleration of potency, and of course from unregulated sources. And remembering that all of this is just a click away. It's all available online to us here in Australia. That may be illegal, but shock, it happens. Other factors are method of use, and I've touched on that: smoking, eating, vaping. The ratio of the components, the methodology that you can buy plant material in stores or online that has high CBD, that is really not supported by the data. It's pretty much been bred out of the plant, and it's been absolutely verified by reliable laboratories. I would add caution to people who believe claims of a high CBD, low THC product without verification. Recent reviews have also documented a range of adverse behavioural and health effects of cannabis, including increased risk of motor vehicle crashes. You've got about double the risk of causing a fatal car accident if you're intoxicated with cannabis. And I note there's discussion at the moment about changing the laws, about the per se laws about cannabis on roadside drug testing for those who claim they're using medicinally. So that's certainly one to watch. Experience of respiratory distress. We've not yet seen convincing evidence about the association with lung cancer, but we have yet the time to catch up with what we see with tobacco in terms of length, years of use. But certainly wheezing, bronchitis, etc., are markedly increased amongst cannabis users. Impairments in learning, memory and attention, educational failure. For those who are regular users, younger than 16 years, when every other factor that predicts educational performance is controlled for, we still see 3 times the risk of leaving school without educational qualifications amongst that group compared to their peers. And this means, of course, if you don't have any educational qualification, you're not set up for a vocation in life. So that is associated with a significant increase in welfare, dependence, poverty, and also crime. The development of psychosis is something I'll just mention a little bit more about because it is the most commonly discussed cannabis-related harm. And there's still much debate about chicken or egg, but my summation of the literature with my colleagues would be that whilst cannabis use typically precedes the first psychotic symptom, and it does seem to be making an important contribution to causes of cannabis, the relationship is clearly not one-to-one because as cannabis use goes up, we don't see the same kind of direct increase in schizophrenia and psychosis. But to me, that's not the most important issue. The important issue is about not using cannabis if you're a high-risk person or if particularly once you've been diagnosed. Just to highlight why I say that, when we look at substance-induced psychosis, alcohol is most commonly associated with a drug-induced psychosis. People don't know that, but it's true because so many people use alcohol. And as more people use cannabis, that will drive that data as well. But only 5% of people with an alcohol-induced psychosis will go on to get a diagnosis of schizophrenia in their lifetime. This is compared with 30% of those who have had an amphetamine-induced psychosis. And of course, we hear a great deal about amphetamine-associated psychoses. But for those with a cannabis-induced psychosis, almost half of them, particularly males, will go on to develop a full schizophrenia over their lifetime. So a cannabis-induced psychosis should not be brushed aside as a one-off. It is, in fact, a concerning marker for an ongoing psychotic disorder over life. Just to briefly look at the literature, any cannabis use overall increases the risk of developing a psychosis by 2, doubling. Amongst heavy users, double again, almost 4 times as likely. And adolescent use, which is heavy, increases the risk 6-fold of developing a psychosis. One of the other concerning factors is from initiation of regular monthly use to the onset of psychosis is about 6 years. So rather than being on average 21 at their first diagnosis, if they're not cannabis users, it goes down to 18. And we all recall those important things that happened between 18 and 21, finishing our schooling, going to university, or choosing some other trade or professional goal, and establishing those lifelong friendships, for example. So missing out on those 3 years, if a psychosis is inevitable, sadly, in your life, avoiding cannabis use can give you 3 more years of developing a really healthy foundation to your life before you become unwell. And beyond causation, it's really what happens if you continue to use cannabis after you've been diagnosed. And study after study shows that it's associated with reduced compliance with therapy and psychiatric medication, leads to more hospitalizations and relapse, particularly associated with the increased level of psychotic dementia symptoms, so hallucinations and delusions, increased family distress, and naturally increased cost to the community as people are not becoming entirely well. Looking at the other common mental health concerns, cannabis users are more likely to experience depression and anxiety than non-users, and those with anxiety and depression are more likely to report using cannabis than those who don't have those disorders. The most recent systemic review of the relationship between adolescent cannabis use and later depression, anxiety, or suicidal thoughts up to the age of 32 found an increased risk of developing major depression, about 7% in young adulthood, and concerningly, suicidality, especially attempts, are 3.5 times more likely amongst cannabis users. And at a time where the whole nation, the whole world is going through such a terrible stressor, where we're most concerned about mental health, we see an increase in cannabis use from those surveys that have been done this year. This is really a horrible combination. This translates to more than 400,000 young adult cases of depression that are potentially attributable to cannabis exposure in the US. So that's a pretty concerning kind of data point. Interesting, the same thing was not seen for anxiety. Just the final point on harms I wanted to make, mostly because it's my area of specialty, and it is the most common harm associated with regular use, is cannabis use disorder, more commonly thought of as addiction or dependence. And this is just a graph of the proportion of drug users who have ever used a drug who will go on to become dependent. Tobacco up there is the big one, where 1 in 3 of those who ever use tobacco will go on to develop a dependence on it, followed by heroin and the ones we know, crystal meth and crack cocaine, through to alcohol, 1 in 7 to 8, the non-crystal, so amphetamines, the powders, 1 in 9, and cannabis is 1 in 9 to 1 in 11, typically thought to be about 10%. So we have a significant level of problem in our community. It hasn't been measured for more than 10 years here in Australia, but probably the average percentage of Australians with a cannabis use disorder is about 2%. So about 500,000 people who are dependent on cannabis in our community. And this, of course, is related to cannabis policy as well. We've had decriminalised cannabis in 3 jurisdictions for a very long time. Probably most people don't seem to be aware of that. They're arguing for full legalisation when a decriminalisation is a very, very workable alternative. Also in other jurisdictions, you can see that we have diversion programs for minor offences, but there have been some recent changes. As I said, coinciding with the closure of my centre was the change that medicinal cannabis can be accessed by various schemes, but not registered by the TGA, except Nabiximols, Sativex. It's the only one that's actually provided the level of data that we require of every other drug in our country for it to be registered and made available to the community. But medicinal cannabis, for some reason, as it has not been approved by the FDA in the US as a medicine. CBD in semi-synthetic forms, because I've told you about the problems with plant claiming CBD levels, where there's proven to be less than 2% THC, is now a Schedule 4 drug in Australia, and it can be prescribed by any doctor. And there's now talk that low dose, less than 60 milligrams a day, may be approved for pharmacy over-the-counter access next year. I'm frankly perplexed about why almost a homeopathic dose of THC would be made so widely available without evidence of it having any effect at such a low dose. I'm personally familiar with making available 1,200 milligrams a day in a study of its use in cannabis withdrawal. So I'll be watching that with interest. I just don't see the evidence for it. And last year, the ACT passed a bill allowing for possession and growth of small amounts of cannabis for personal use as of end of January this year. This, of course, conflicts with federal law, which prohibit recreational use and also supply. Interestingly, they have not made clear how cannabis users in the ACT will grow their cannabis because seeds aren't allowed. So how this supply comes is also doesn't seem to be that well thought out, but we will watch with interest. So thank you for that, and happy to take questions later. And if you wish to contact me, I'll pop up my contact information now. Thank you very much.